Thanks for coming out on this Friday afternoon. It's good to see so many friends here, including many of our friends. Huh?
Mike isn't on.
I know it's not on.
Oh, okay.
But I am. Okay. This is not a recorded message coming to you. What does this give me? Fox News. I have the occasion this afternoon to introduce one of the most gifted teachers who's combined the study of architecture with political philosophy. He's also one of our dearest friends, going back to the time when we were young boys just beginning to teach at Amherst College back in the 60s. But I want to offer two vignettes to prepare the way for Bill Westfall. There's this moment in Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited when the young, reflective, eccentric Lord Brideshead ponders aloud over the chapel connected to the family castle. And he turns to Charles Ryder and he says he's asking about the quality of the chapel as a work of architecture. And he says, well, Ryder, you're an artist. What do you think of the chapel aesthetically? Is it good art? And Ryder says, I don't know exactly what you mean. I think it's quite a good example of its period. Probably in 80 years it will be greatly admired. He said, but surely, Brideshead says in the voice of Aristotle and Kant, surely it can't be good 20 years ago and good in 80 years and not good now. Ryder spoke with the convictions of the modern historicist. He wouldn't claim to speak about the things that are good or bad outside that epoch in which he lived and he cast his judgments. Judgments of right and wrong in aesthetics as well as in politics were always relative, in this view, to the place and the time. So he would not speak across the historical epochs and pronouncing the goodness or badness of the buildings that were built in ancient Athens or in Paris at the turn of the century. He would not speak, that is, about the things that could be enduringly good. The second vignette is from Princeton several years back when I was visiting, and one day at Staples, waiting in line, I ran into a gal who was a graduate student in history, and I said, oh really, what field, what period? She said, American, 19th century. I said, already we're divided. She said, well, what do you mean? I said, you see, I do think that proposition, as Lincoln called it, all men are created equal, from which everything else flows, then it really was what Lincoln and the founders thought it to be, as Lincoln said, an abstract proposition applicable to all men and all times. And she said, he thought it was true at the time. In other words, the historians were still historicists. They were committed to the notion that we can know moral truths only in the epoch in which they're held, except for the doctrine of historical relativism. That will hold true across all the things. That one we do know. Okay. Now, Lincoln and the founders took seriously that there was an enduring nature that separated human beings from other animals, and it made it wrong to rule human beings in the way the human beings were compelled to rule dogs and horses. Now, as Jefferson said, anyone who denies that has to suggest that the mass of mankind were born with a saddle on their backs, and a privileged few were born with spurs on, ready to ride them. Bill Westfall taught me years ago that the historicist argument comes into play as we ask, why can't we build buildings of the kind that McKim, Mead, and White designed? And the answer was, they were buildings of their time. Right? Why couldn't we regard them as enduringly good? Bill's teaching and writing and architecture and urban form has been a regime of teaching anew to a new generation the principles that will always be there about the things that make buildings not only beautiful, but scale to their purpose in a civic order or a political regime. Bill found an apt home for years teaching in that setting that offered the most elegant examples of the principles he was teaching, Mr. Jefferson's academical village in Charlottesville. He taught there about 20 years, Bill, wasn't it? About 20 years? 17. Until he was called to become dean of one of the few schools of classical architecture in the country at Notre Dame. He's receded from the deanship now as he's phased back in the way to an active retirement and a new manuscript he's working on. My favorite among his books is this beautiful book he did for Penn State University Press, In This Most Perfect Paradise, a study of Alberti and Pope Nicholas V and the emergence of city planning. He's also done others. The talk he's offering today comes out of a larger manuscript on its way to press. Now, every time he sits down to tell me what he's working on, he just enchants me with the story as I get absorbed in it. He is, one of those rare persons who can teach a combination of architecture and political philosophy. He said, well, why don't we do it for this group? As we had Alan Greenberg in last year to do something, this would be just the right thing to do. And so the talk today is the American architecture and the American civic order shared foundations. Join me in welcoming Bill to the podium.
Well, we're going to have a change here. We're going to redo the equipment. I'll just vamp a little bit, and we'll. It's a delight to be here. Hadley and I have been working together for years and years and years. You look back at a certain point, you say, my God, was it that long we were together when we first met and were brought into this? I always considered my time at Amherst to be the fourth degree that I got. You know, you get the bachelor's, then you get the master's, then you get the PhD. And the PhD is an ever deeper penetration into something. And then you emerge out of that hole into the light at a small liberal arts college. And you look at a larger landscape. And Hadley was one of the guides to that larger landscape when we were finding our way around in it all those many years ago. And it was a delight. He and I taught a course together with Fred Chayette, an historian of early French towns. And it was revelatory for me. It was a small group, 17, 15 students, something like that. And we each approached the city from the point of view of each of us. And it was, it's one of those things that changes the way you think about things. What I want to talk about today, I wonder if we need all these lights. Well, we'll find out. I want to talk to you about architecture and the political order. I've joked with students, and this is not in the manuscript that I'm going to present here, but I've joked with students that if I had two bumper stickers for them, or buttons that they could wear on the lapel that would remind them what my message is. One would say politics, that is the life of the political life in the civic order. Politics is more important than architecture. And the other is all buildings are made out of other buildings or parts of other buildings. On all of that rests the law and the prophets, as they say. I want to talk about three things. The first is about buildings as the most conspicuous and unavoidable and long-lasting evidence of what people value. You look at a building and say, that's what they consider important. The second is the expression that they provide an expression of what people consider to be beautiful. Not a word you hear much in architecture studios these days, except at Notre Dame, of course. And then the third is, if we think of both of those as being part of the classical tradition, what we have today is an abandonment of that classical tradition and the failure of that tradition to assist us in our pursuit of happiness. So that's the agenda. I want to point out that I'm using the term classical here in kind of a standard way. One is to refer to antiquity, and the other is to refer to the highest criteria for assessing anything or any idea or so on, the criteria that are highest and that in one way or another embody the good in things we do and the truth of things we think we know and the beautiful in things we make, the three great transcendentals. I also will be arguing that there is a classical tradition that now is approaching 3 millennia in age, and that there have been two important turning points in that tradition, which are going to be my focus this evening. One was in the 16th century. It was quite a dramatic century. It's one century after my favorite century, which was the 15th. But in the 16th century, we get the Reformation. We get the reaction to events in the 15th century. We get the Reformation. We get the rise of the nation state. We get the early stages of the new mathematics. We get the beginnings of the empirical method. And we get innovative ways of thinking about nature in the broadest sense, not merely as physical nature, but also as the sense that includes human nature. Now, I'm going to pay only, what we find there is, you can say, the beginning of modernity, but what I want to emphasize is not modernity, but the modern. The modern, a nice word, develops by the Italians in the 14th century to explain to themselves why they are so great compared to how things used to be, which was antiquity. So you get modern as now, and it's still now. We live in the modern age. Unfortunately, as I'll say later, the idea of the modern, the way we live now, has been taken over by the concept of modernity, which requires that every yesterday be made obsolete by today. So one of the great moments in the classical tradition, one of the recent ones, was in the 16th century, and the second one, of course, was in the later 18th century. And we live in the civil order, the constitutional order that came from that fundamental modernism of, that is, modernizing of the classical tradition. We start with an image. If it works, it goes. I got it turned around, backwards, there it goes. Okay. What we see here is kind of cute. It's, as it says, it's an image from Venice in the early 16th century. And it shows a walled enclosure. Here's a guy over here with a cannon. And he's shooting balls. Maybe you can see them. And what they're doing is applying new mathematics to the trajectory of cannonballs, the part of warfare. And watching this exploration are the 7 liberal arts. So here's the natural sciences being reviewed by the 7 liberal arts, the medieval heirs of the classical tradition. Out here is Euclid. And these are the officials. They're dressed in the garb of officials of the civic order. And they are not allowed to come in because that experiment has not been properly understood yet. Much less has been passed on to the next level, which is here. Aristotle and Plato, who are in that inner sanctum, that inner precinct of that larger precinct. And here it says, same words that were above Plato's Academy, let no man who knows not geometry enter herein. Isn't that wonderful? That's the 16th century. What we have here is the beginning of the development of the natural sciences based on mathematics. And later I'll show you what becomes of that later on in later centuries in Europe. You would not find an image like that on the continent, across the channel, because the British had a very different way of going about this exploration. They were infatuated, intrigued by the power of the new empirical sciences. Thomas Jefferson, you know, he wrote from France, and I think it's important that he wrote from France, that the 3 greatest people who ever lived, the 3 greatest who have ever lived, Newton, Bacon, and Locke. Newton, Bacon, and Locke, right? Now Newton, well, he was, really, they loved him in the continent. And Jefferson loved not only Newton, but also Bacon and Locke. So the founders are squarely on the side of finding how to use, and the British were squarely on the side of finding how to use the classical tradition with its modern innovations. So tradition is always kept alive by innovation, but innovation that is policed by the liberal arts and reviewed by the philosophy. Now, the way Jefferson handled this in architecture, we can see it in a couple of his buildings, and I'm only going to touch on a few of his buildings. One is the Capitol in Richmond, shown here before it got its steps. They come later. They don't come until the very early 20th century because they ran out of money. But as you can see, they're based. It is based upon the ancient Roman temple in the south of France called the Maison Carree. And Jefferson, when he sent the plans from Paris, he'd been playing around with temples as civic buildings for 10 or so years before he went to France in 1785. When he sent the plans in 1785, after he'd been there about a little less than a year, he said 2 methods, I'm quoting from Jefferson. Ever try to paraphrase Jefferson? You can't do it. He's just so precise. 2 methods of proceeding presented themselves to my mind. The one was to leave to some architect to draw an external according to his fancy, in which way experience shows about once in 1,000 times a pleasing form is hit upon. The other was to take some model already devised and approved by the general suffrage of the world. I had no hesitation in deciding that the latter was best. Now, the term fancy there, to find an external according to his fancy, fancy there refers to the inventive imagination. That's the way the word was used in the 18th century. He found his model in what he called, and I quote again, one of the most beautiful, if not the most beautiful, and precious morsel of architecture left to us by antiquity. And you see the comparison there. Now, almost 4 decades later, when he's quite an old man, he enlarged upon his comments about the Richmond Capitol. He said, it is on the model of the temples of Erechtheus in Athens, of Baalbek and the Maison Carree in Nimes, all of which are nearly of the same form and proportions, and are considered as the most perfect examples of cubic architecture, as the Pantheon of Rome is of the spherical. What? These are the 3 cubic examples. Now, if a student on a midterm were to refer to all 3 as being cubic, you'd say, look again. There are a bunch of parallelepipeds, to be sure, and parallelepipeds can be reduced to cubes, to be sure, but that's not what Jefferson means. He's using the word cubic to refer to the distillation of right-angle parallelepipeds to its most pure form, the cube. Just as he's using the word spherical to refer to that which is equal in all its parts. In other words, he's talking about proportionality, not proportions. And I'll say more about that a little later. When he sent the plans for the Richmond Capitol back to Virginia, he said that he had to change, how did he put it? Nearly all, the cubic and the spherical are, the proportionality stand above specific forms and the ratios of proportions. He wrote that although he changed the configuration of the inside and of the dimensions, because he had to make it bigger than the model down in Nimes, he said nonetheless their proportions were rigorously preserved, by which he means they retained the proportionality that is epitomized by the cube. Now, one of the things that he's referring to is the greater importance of what he referred to as the external and the model than the interior configuration. In other words, he was not designing the building according to form follows function, but according to form adheres to the proportionality that can make it beautiful. So, the appearance of the building as a civic monument that is beautiful, and its beauty serves the civil order, is much more important than the mere utilitarian interior, which is going to get messed around with anyway. He wrote almost at the same time to Madison from Paris, and he says, the Capitol and the other public buildings serving the new civic institutions were to, and here I quote, to present our countrymen with models for their study and imitation. Furthermore, he said, their object is to improve the taste of my countrymen, to increase their reputation, to reconcile them to the respect of the world, and procure them their praise. Now, those are 4 different reasons. Let's look at them. First, to provide our country with models for their study and imitation. He would say the same thing about the actions of the officials of the civic order. The second is to improve the taste of my countrymen. Now, he is not using taste in the sense that it had developed in France. That is, I like it, you don't, it's my taste, not yours, tough. He's using taste as a refinement of the understanding of the beautiful. And so he wants to improve the taste, the understanding of the beautiful of his countrymen. Third, to increase their reputation, to reconcile them to the respect of the world. In other words, if they are a cultivated people, they have a refined taste, that will increase their reputation, and it will bring them favor from those elsewhere in the world. Sounds a lot like what they were hoping for from the new Constitution, didn't it? And procure them, the countrymen, the world's praise. How was he going to do that? He was going to do that in the same way buildings are always judged within the classical tradition. One is that they follow the proper, trustworthy, vouched for conventions for designing a building. What he referred to as the qualities that have earned the approbation of the world, of time. So in other words, they have to look proper. They have to look decorous. One of the ways, only one of the ways of doing that, of course, is the way that we're all familiar with when we think about classical architecture, which is by using the 5 orders. Now, the funny thing about the 5 orders is that they're all alike compared to things that are not like them, but they're different from one another, and they're all different in the same way. That is to say, they all have a base, but the bases are always different. That is a pedestal, and a base, and a shaft, and so on for all the parts. So they all have all the same parts, but they're all rearranged a little bit differently according to the needs of the individual building. And the other condition that you look for is the thing that Jefferson's already talked about, proportionality. In basing public buildings on the best models, he was asking for direct comparison with other praiseworthy buildings, both ancient and modern. If we can build well, they will take us seriously. Now, to finalize the design of the Capitol, Jefferson had learned his architecture from books. He hadn't seen a really good building till he got to Paris. And when he got to Paris, a funny thing happened. He didn't like what he saw. Now, this goes against the common wisdom, that he absorbed his architectural understanding from the French. There is no evidence of that. Instead, he said that the architecture in Paris is far from chaste. But he had managed to find an architect whose taste had been formed on a study of the ancient models of this art, namely a man named Clarisseau, who helped him with some of the details, some of the architectural details. Chastity was virtue, because the new nation lacked skilled builders, which made it, hard to build fancy things. But more importantly, it promoted simplicity and clean outlines uncluttered by superfluous ornament and decoration, and this sparseness enhanced the legibility of the geometric order and the building's alliance with cubic and spherical proportionality. Now, the British exhibited a similar penchant for the spareness and chastity and clarity and so on, which made it quite different from the continental buildings being built in France, elsewhere on the continent, except for Carl Friedrich Schenkel in Berlin, which is another story, but that's not to be told here. Later in the 19th century, American taste and British taste departed from the chaste, from the simple, from the plain. And you've been to London and you've seen that most of it you would not call plain and chaste and simple. And much of what was built in America, you could say the same things about. But then, at the turn of the century, around 1900, 1880, 1885 to that wonderful period running up to about 1930, things changed. And both the British and the Americans went back to something rather more classical, rather more traditional, but the English kept it quite fancy, and the Americans retained or restored chastity. All you need to do is to compare the Paris Opera House and New York Public Library, or any number of other buildings from that period, from around the turn of the century, the great buildings of the City Beautiful movement and so on. So what they've done is learn from the French how to design these buildings, and then, in order that their taste be refined and Americanized, the American Academy in Rome was established in 1893, 1894 by one of the great architects, Charles Fulton McKim, to provide a finishing school for American architects after they studied in Paris and after they had been in some of the American offshoots of the Beaux-Arts system in America. So what we find is the simplicity, the clarity, which allows the proportionality to be clear, and for the role of the building to be quite evident. The role of the building, the service it renders to the civil order, and its relationship to other buildings. Now, the more important the building, the more likely it is to have a framework that is provided by the ancient models. The humbler the role of the building, the more likely it is to draw on later, newer interpretations of the classical tradition. And so I show you Thomas Jefferson's University of Virginia, one of the pavilions, which is much more based on Palladio, 16th century person I'll come to in a little bit, than it was on ancient architecture. But Palladio, working in 16th century Venice, was very much in the classical Italian tradition. And what we have at the University of Virginia, although I'm only showing you a couple of them, are 10 variations on the same modern classicism, modern in two steps, one out of the 16th century, the other out of the very early 19th century by Jefferson. We also see here buildings that could very easily be explained to be what? Cubic, right? Let me show you an example of the spherical. Now, one of the things that makes the sphericity, if you want to use that word, quite evident in the rotunda is the temple front in front, which is an example of the cubic. So one of the things that brings out the clarity of the proportionality is the juxtaposition of these two, the sphericity and the cubic. We also see that for the library, which is the head which is the head of the university. He goes back to an ancient model. He goes back to the Pantheon in Rome. So again, an older building becomes the example becomes the model for the more important building. Let's take a look then at a building you all know, I'm sure, Monticello. Now, this is a private residence. Of course, it's the private residence of a very important public person. He didn't know how important he was going to be when he built a little part in black. And when he came back from Paris, he began enlarging it as Secretary of State. And I'll show you what he designed after he retired from the presidency in a moment. But here you see a very rich proportionality involving the spherical, now converted into an octagon, and of the cubic, both in the central thing here with an octagon cubic, octagon sphericity here, and so on. Quite an elaborate building, very rich. Now they say, you will read in the books, that the reason he built it that way was because he was following earlier models. Well, oops, I don't want that yet. I'm there, so I'll use it. When he was president, he began tinkering with the building that he would retire to after the presidency. He was eager to get back to private life. And so a 2-hour horseback ride away from Charlottesville, over near Lynchburg, he built Poplar Forest. Began it in 1806, and he describes it as a building very much of his fancy. Oops. He showed me where the back is and it backs up. So the sphere becomes an octagon. You can perhaps see the landscape back here. You enter on this level in the front, but you go directly into the basement level from the back, from the garden side. So it has the front and the garden as two different sides. The building was so clumsy when he first designed it that, this is the front porch, this is the back porch. You couldn't get the stuff from the kitchen to him up here eating unless you went outside. And so they insisted, well, you gotta build some stairs. So he put these little boxes on either side which hold the stairs. There's a few other changes. And if you haven't been to Poplar Forest, you have a real treat in store for you. It's a beautiful building. But it's a fancy. It's the product of his imagination. But it's an imagination that thinks in traditional classical architectural terms, and it thinks in terms of proportionality. And it also, and this is a characteristic of American architecture, it thinks in terms of the landscape. It thinks in terms of the landscape. Here it is, as it appeared at Jefferson's death. There's the building with its wing with more kitchens and places for the slaves and so on, and others. But what I want to call attention to is the way it is set into the landscape in a great circle. So the circle actually can be thought of as an octagon. The octagon then is there as the building itself. And what do you find in the very center of the octagon? A perfect cube, 20 by 20 by 20. Skylit. And of course, like all of Jefferson's roof, leaked like a sieve. So far, I've argued that Jefferson sought beauty for buildings by imitating the order, harmony, and proportionality of nature. Now, a longer treatment would explain all the things that I mean there, but I want to go into his background for thinking in those terms. I'm going to begin with a brief encounter with the education that Jefferson and his fellow founders received when they were still British subjects, and which they valued even after independence. While the empiricists on the continent were being fitted for lab coats to explore the natural sciences, their colleagues across the channel were rethinking the understanding of human nature that they had inherited from traditional ideas, both domestic and imported. Human nature, in both its moral and its aesthetic sense, was especially important to them. And so too was the tradition of English common law. English common law holds that every individual is by nature a free and lawful man, and endowed by nature with the capacity to know right from wrong and truth from falsehood. Now that premise in turn is congruent with the imported classical natural law Aristotle and Cicero explicated as the universal law that takes particular formulations in different civil laws. I suppose most of you know all this. On the continent, its part in the classical tradition, as it touched on aesthetic and moral theory, was being put to tests by empiricism and failing those tests. And hence, goodness, truth, and beauty as fundamental properties of human nature were jettisoned, but the English and Scottish authors were busy enriching and reformulating the traditions. In aesthetic theory, Sir Christopher Wren, good friend and collaborator of Newton, observed that beauty is in the figures with, quote, uniformity, that is equality, and proportion, and that, quote, all consent as to a law of nature that the square and the circle are most beautiful. In 1711, Anthony Ashley Cooper, 3rd Earl of Shaftesbury, allied the beautiful and the good, both of those with nature and all with the, and I quote, same fixed standard, nature will not be mocked. Francis Hutcheson, 1726, observed that all men possess an inner sense that allows them to receive, quote, ideas of beauty from all objects in which there is uniformity amidst variety. Think of the University of Virginia lawn. A cylinder or prism has universal beauty, and columns with entices that answer, quote, better the supposed intentions of stability, they please more. The author of nature, he asserts, equipped us with a sense of beauty and has given us a moral sense to direct our actions and to give us still nobler pleasures. David Hume endorsed this position and added, the general principle of taste are uniform in human nature. Where men vary is in their judgment. Some defect or perversion in the faculties may commonly be remarked, proceeding either from prejudice, from want of practice, or want of delicacy, and there is just reason for approving one taste and condemning another. Now I want to repeat Hume's words. There is just reason, Hume wrote, which means that beauty has a foundation in reason and is open to disputation. This idea has been dismissed on the continent where beauty was more personal taste and preference. It was in the eye of the beholder, and it was beyond disputation. Now, Henry Home, Lord Kames, raised the classical principle of decorum when he noted because an aristocrat's position carries authority, he must be exemplary of the good in his acts, and his palace must please the eye. He also noted that architecture lacks things to imitate, and therefore, quote, the timid hand is guided by rule and compass, and accordingly in architecture, strict regularity and uniformity are studied as far as consistent with utility. Regularity, uniformity, proportion, and congruity are all equally essential. There's one small indication about architecture is an art of imitation, even though it has nothing to imitate as painting and sculpture do. They are arts of representation that use imitation to make representation. Architecture is an art of imitation direct. Now these are reasonable propositions. That is, they are congruent with English common law tradition, they are vouched for by classical natural law, and they accept the recognition that human nature is equipped with both a moral and an aesthetic sense. Now, ancient doctrine made the beautiful an aspect of the good. And it accepted early modern political theory also found them allied. In the early 14th century, the lawyer Marsilius of Padua articulated a theory that justified the regimes of the little central Italian cities that sought the liberty to govern themselves free of the tyranny of their papal overlords. I won't give you the gory details of the Babylonian captivity and the other wonderful events of the 14th century. It's the 15th century that's the good one, but some good things came out of the 14th. In the early 14th century, Marsilius argued that justice need not be handed down from overlords, but could be discovered, his word, through the collective reason of what he called the human legislator, which is the people, the whole body of citizens, excluding, of course, quote, children, slaves, aliens, and women. We're not in the modern age yet. Here, Marsilius had inserted the wedge that would open political equality to citizens. He also enlarged on Aristotle by asserting, and again I quote, the less learned citizens can sometimes perceive something which must be corrected in a proposed law, even though they could not have discovered it in the law itself. Quite an interesting statement. But furthermore, and this is where things get really interesting, they were also capable of judging things they were incapable of making, such as, and I quote, the quality of a picture, a house, a ship, and other works of art, that is, of craftsmanship. So you may not be able to make it, but by God, you can sure judge whether it's right or wrong, beautiful or not. And then the person who can actually make it can correct the errors that anyone can see, or that the unskilled person can see. Now, all of this was absorbed by Leon Battista Alberti in the middle of the 15th century in his architectural treatise, which is generally treated as simply a rehashing of the ancient treatise written by Vitruvius, but in fact, it is a radically innovative treatment of imitation, beauty, and the role of the architect, whom he presented as a Republican citizen. The architect was to use his special expertise in collaboration with his fellow citizens in seeking the good and protecting the liberty of his civil order. The monarchs who were building modern nation states much preferred Vitruvius's definition of the architect as a person who does his patron's bidding. But Alberti's role of the citizen architect did go down well among the aristocrats in Venice, who managed to retain their city's liberty in monarchic Europe until Napoleon conquered them. Their architect was Andrea Palladio, and his treatise from 1570 shows that he had absorbed Alberti's argument. Read Alberti, then read Palladio, and you'll see they're the same. There's Palladio on the left, there's Lord Burlington on the right. The aristocrats who governed Georgian England were more like Palladio's Venetians than like any of Vitruvius's patrons. Palladio became their preceptor in matters architectural, and Jefferson's as well. A fellow Virginian visited Jefferson and then wrote to a friend of his who said he and TJ had talked for a long time about architecture, and Jefferson had proclaimed that Palladio was his Bible. You should get it and stick close to it. It is often said that Jefferson absorbed lessons in architecture from France, but this is supposedly the model for Monticello, but obviously it is still closer to the Villa Rotunda, which is considered an important model, but not as important as the building whose construction Jefferson watched and wrote about while he was in France. He wrote that he had a very awkward place to sit on the Tuileries garden, and in order to watch, he had to crick his neck around, and he got a a crick in his neck that caused him difficulty for some time, and so on. But I think what he was watching in that construction was the construction of the dome, which he then used at Monticello, he used in the original House of Representatives, and he used at the Rotunda at UVA. So Jefferson makes it quite clear he didn't think much of what was going on in France architecturally. In his last letter, he wrote what Hadley said in the introduction. The mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few booted and spurred, ready to ride them legitimately by the grace of God. Last letter he wrote. The new republic he helped found incorporated the central kernel of English common law and the basic premise of natural law that put each person's moral well-being in his own capable hands. From Paris, Jefferson wrote, state a moral case to a plowman and a professor. The former will decide it well, and often better than the latter, because he has not been led astray by artificial rules. This morning's New York Times had a juxtaposition that I put on one sheet of paper, and there's a couple of copies of it floating around. Because this gets extended to aesthetic propositions, which is to say that ordinary people have a better sense of what ought to be built, what is beautiful, than the, quote, experts. And so on the one hand, we have the Commission of Fine Arts approving the design of that absolutely horrendously bad Eisenhower Memorial by Carree. And in the letters section, we have a letter from somebody in New York, I don't know who it is, saying, I wish they would quit building these stupid-looking buildings. They're ruining the city. So that's the ordinary person who is not led astray by artificial rules. And remember that the purpose of beautiful public buildings, according to Jefferson, is to enhance the reputation and reconcile the world to the praise they must give the cultivated Americans who love and produce beauty. Now we find this in Palladio. Palladio says, one cannot but curse the way of building, which departing from what the natural order of things teaches, and from that simplicity which appears in things created by her, generates, as it were, another version of nature and deviates from the true, good, and beautiful method of building. And though variety and novelty, what Jefferson called fancy, must please everybody, one should not, however, do anything that is contrary to the laws of this art and contrary to what reason makes obvious. Now, Inigo Jones had planted Palladio's architecture in Stuart, England. Sir Christopher Wren then drew on more elaborate and enriched models that served post-Trent Catholicism in Louis XIV's France. Jefferson would observe that the Stuart expulsion, and I quote, broke the thread of pretended inheritance, extinguished all regal usurpations, love the word, usurpations, and the English nation re-entered into its rights. In Georgian Britain, aesthetic theory soon endorsed Palladianism, and English Palladianism gave a face to natural law British-American foundations for government with simple, chaste buildings whose proportionality imitated the order, harmony, and proportionality of nature and made what Cicero and Palladio referred to as a second nature. Meanwhile, Jefferson wrote that the kings, hereditary nobles, and priests take the earnings of the laboring people and leave them with only enough to obtain a sufficient surplus barely to sustain a scanty and miserable life. And those triflings they apply to maintain their privileged order and splendor and idleness to fascinate the eyes of the people and excite in them an humble adoration and submission as to an order of superior beings. That's what that architecture shows. And that's what, of course, what Jefferson would avoid. Jefferson's crowd favored buildings, the kinds of buildings that the overlords, but still aristocratic factors in England were building. Let's take a look at Holcombe Hall, or Houghton Hall, 1722. Seat of Robert Walpole, first British Prime Minister. Compared to what we just saw in France, they are quite humble. Let's go one step down to chastity and clarity. And the House of Dukes of Leinster, which is often recognized as one of the models for the White House, and the White House as it was before it got Latrobe's portico and the bulge in the back, and after the British had kind of made it necessary to redecorate it. Now consider the political theory accompanying these American buildings, and it is as it is articulated in the Federalist Papers, probably not comments that I need to make to this crowd, but I'll make them anyway. Here we find the reason and nature of things, and we've seen those words in Palladio and in earlier things, the reason and nature of things providing the foundation for the civil order. Federalist 14, Madison. The people of America, whilst they have paid a decent regard to the opinions of former times and other nations, they have not suffered a blind veneration for antiquity, for custom, or for names, that is, titles, and have brought about numerous innovations displayed in the American theater in favor of private rights and public happiness. Or Madison in Federalist 51. What is government itself but the greatest of all reflections of human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. Federalist 9, Alexander Hamilton. The science of politics, like most other sciences, has received great improvements. Among them are wholly new discoveries, have made their principal progress toward perfection in modern times. We find a parallel in Federalist 78, contrast between taste corresponding to circumstances and beauty that nourishes perception universally, when Hamilton notes that the tests of the positive, that is statutory law, are in a higher standard, which is the nature and reason of the thing. As the beginning of Federalist 31, he put the primacy of natural law premise to work. In disquisitions of every sort, there are certain primary truths or first principles on which all subsequent reasonings must depend. He offers 4 examples from geometry, including all right angles are equal. Among axioms in ethics and politics stands the principle that the means must be proportioned to the end. He adds inferences from axioms that are obvious to themselves and so on. Jefferson's position is congruent with Palladio's, which is consonant with what we find in these papers and in the lectures of law by guess who? James Wilson. He began his chapter of the general principles of law and obligation this way. Order, proportion, and fitness pervade the universe. Around us we see, within us we feel, above us we admire a rule from which a deviation cannot, or should not, or will not be made. The historian of law, Richard O. Sullivan, has written that Newton, Bacon, and Locke, Jefferson's favorites, uncovered, quote, the necessary principles and rules of moral actions. These principles and rules of natural law have their origin in the order of the world and in a view of man as a part of that order, and in a study, too, of the inner constitution of man, of psychology, and of ethics, and the metaphysical foundations of our being. Now, Jefferson's buildings are lucid explications of this. They tie us to antiquity, they embody innovations, they provide a decorous portrayal of what is important in our civil order, and they do so with a distinctly American chastity and simplicity. People understand that buildings represent authority. After all, it takes a lot of power and authority and money to build them. Otherwise, this New Yorker cartoon would not be humorous. But notice, it's an ancient temple or a bank. You know what this building is? Inscriptions and lintels are always very important. What's that lintel say? What's that inscription say? Right there in the middle. Paul V, Borghese, a Roman. I'm the Pope. I built this thing. It's interesting that Borghese is the same word as bourgeois, but we'll leave that aside. Another Roman family built a smaller church. It was the Gucci family. Wonderful little building. Santa Susanna, incidentally, that's the American church in Rome. So if you're in Rome, you want an American service, American this and that, that's where the Notre Dame students go for their stuff. Virginia, Palmyra Courthouse, 1830, one of my favorites. You see, it uses the Doric order, and the Doric order with triglyphs and metaphase, which means it can't have an inscription there. So they put the inscription on the lintel, and what's it say? The maxim held sacred by all free people, obey the laws. All right. Of course, that means those people made those laws. That's what that means. And that's a fine embodiment of the American spirit. You know what we're building these days? Let me show you some more recent buildings. I kind of like this. This is in Washington or somewhere. Now, these are some of the new palaces of justice that the judges have been building. And St. Louis, HOK. HOK builds all of the sports arenas. They're especially in sports and hospitals, and apparently in courthouses. McKinnell Coleman, Cleveland, in Cleveland, Coleman, McKinnell, and Wood, they built the Boston City Hall, which is a big controversy now. Many people think it's so damned ugly it ought to be torn down, but the preservationists say, but it's a good example of its time. Jesus, aren't they crazy? Here's Phoenix and in Islip. Richard Meyer has been building cool buildings for a long time. So I guess we have cool justice here. And notice how these buildings never...
That slide you just did, the Chicago one? No, the one back. Say, look, that's got a lot of classical vocabulary in it.
Oh, yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah.
It's not displeasing. Do you find it displeasing? Yeah.
We'll talk about it.
I'm an ordinary person.
You've been led astray by your... These are not... The Harry International apparently is an architectural firm. And then Richard Meyer, there he is again. Now that is a commercial building on the left. It's a bad slide only because it didn't come out very well from the internet. But the one on the right, I mean, that's another courthouse. Commercial, federal courthouse, what is it? And there's Salt Lake. Oh, gee, their originality is just, it just screams at you, right? It is cubic. These are not. These are not. These are one of the architects at Morphosis declared once, "Thank God we are free of the tyranny of tradition." You bet. This is, I've tried to find the name of the architect of this one. One of the enemy of traditional architecture is bad traditional architecture. This is, the equivalent to this in a college essay would be an F. Now, what are these buildings about? Here's my argument. They are not about the tradition based on the imitation of nature that provides the buildings of classical architecture that serve regimes, civil orders, that are based on the imitation of nature. when nature is understood as the source of the good, the true, and the beautiful, and hence of justice. Now, where did these buildings come from? They came from what happened when the savants were dismissed. Plato and Aristotle were found not to be able to satisfy the empirical standards that were applied to them. And when Euclid had left and let these guys in to take over the canons. One of my professors at Columbia when I was a graduate student was Paul Oscar Christeller, a wonderful, wonderful man. And I found a wonderful statement by, he was a philosopher, a historian of Renaissance philosophy. Writing about the 19th century, he noted with surprise, I'm quoting him, that an age that found it difficult to believe God created the world out of nothing apparently had no difficulty in believing that the human artist could create his work out of nothing. On the aftermath of World War II, what happened was that modernist architects who had developed a new architecture to serve new revolutionary political regimes, mainly in Central Europe, after the existing political regimes had discredited themselves through World War I, launched a new architecture to bring about a new world. In this country, it was called public housing, and we know what became of that. But it still is the most pervasive brew that is drunk by architects. They broke the necessary alliance between the civil order and the architectural order. They promoted architecture as a fine art, part as an avant-garde, not as a civic art, but part of an avant-garde whose purpose, as Jose Ortega y Gasset has explained, quote, helps the elite to recognize themselves and one another in the drab mass of society and to learn their mission, which consists of being few and holding their own against the many. That's the avant-garde. More than 70 years ago, the education of architects was transformed to make architecture schools into either technical schools or descendants of Rabelais' Abbé of Telemaine, where the inscription above the door said, "Do as you wish." Paradoxically, both kinds of school trained these architects to engage in mimetic rivalry as they vie in to honor the demands of the zeitgeist in order to make every building be of its time, while also serving the interests of those who hire them, that is, low budget, build it on time. Even before World War II, it was clear that modernist architecture had failed to fulfill its utopian program. In America, the post-war recovery, the innovations they served, the innovations that served the arsenal of democracy were absorbed into the profession of architecture, and it was taken over by the commercial market that was devoted to producing an abundance of goods. Architecture now shifted wholesale from serving the city devoted to the good to being a fashionable accessory in the city as market. The civil order still had authority over what was built, but it delegated that authority to the profession of architecture and the market it served. Lost in this shift was the just proportionality between the offerings of the market's goods and the civil order's commitment to the good, identified as the pursuit of happiness. Modernist architecture has become the very emblem of commercial prosperity, and it is one of the principal cultural exports of the United States in a world that is increasingly knitted together into a global marketplace. At home and abroad, the products of modernist architecture have overwhelmed the traditional city, the good city, the agent for securing the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity, the cities whose civil order rests in the hands of we the people. This outcome was not inevitable and is not irredeemable. The suppression of architecture as a civic art serving the American civil order happened within my lifetime. Of course, I'm getting pretty old, but so is modernism. And civic arts restoration has also been gaining force within my lifetime. I am only slightly younger than Cass Gilbert's Supreme Court building. And I believe that its inscription is as important and as worthy as an aspiration now as it was when it became a decoration in that frieze. In Richmond, where I live, there was a time when Jefferson's capital commanded the city. There it is. It also commanded the landscape and the Commonwealth, and it stood at the acme of the civil order. Less than a century ago, its prominence began to be obscured. A photo taken from the same place. There, you can find it. There it is. Today, if you know where to look, you can find it. But in Richmond and all across the land, with the prominence of the American version of the classical tradition eclipsed, and with modernism's now hegemony providing architecture's most conspicuous presence, it is understandable why we find otherwise intelligent and patriotic people in universities, corporations, public bodies, and the institutions of the American civil order embracing modernism as if there is no alternative. But there is, and it is enjoying a revival. I conclude with a single example, a building only a few years old, one that shows that while the restoration of American architecture to its foundations in nature is long overdue, it is also possible if we work for it. Another federal courthouse. With that, I invite your comments.
We planned also a reception downstairs in the library. We have drinks and we can continue the conversation. So Bill, are you open for just a couple of questions before
Sure.
we
Oh, yeah.
Bill Granville.
It seems to me Jefferson was right and wrong. I think he was right in seeing that the architecture, the high architecture of Europe at that time, were symbols of the church and the monarchies, the aristocracy. And he, of course, was post-vote. But I think he was wrong in thinking human nature stops at bare buildings. Human nature it has a desire to ornament. We are ornamenting animals. We ornament our bodies. We ornament our caves. We ornament. And so I think this kind of architectural chastity, as he referred to it, I think was a mistaken notion of what our architecture should be. And I think perhaps he was making a virtue of necessity. Like the way he changed the order of the capital because he didn't get the Carree capital in America, which is true. I mean, he couldn't ornament his buildings, so we didn't have the artisans to do it. So
And he did.
Made that a virtue. He really it was almost like a chauvinistic excuse,
Well,
rather than a clear rationalization.
there are two things. Milton Grenfell is an excellent architect here in Washington, and does these kinds of wonderful buildings. It is true that in 1785, it was best not to go beyond the skill of the masons, of the craftsmen in America, the builders in America. 50 years later, when he's working at UVA, he's carefully get the ornament right. But there's two things that ornament do, and he uses both of them right, and he doesn't want a superfluity to get in the way. Because ornament, on the one hand, indicates how the structure is working. And decoration, I like to differentiate the two. Decoration has the word decorum in it. It tells you how important this building is. So one way of showing this is by the hierarchy of the orders. So the library at UVA is Corinthian. The houses, the pavilions, are a variety, useful for instruction to the architectural amateur and professional, he said. And the colonnade, that is shelter and transition and so on, is the lowest order, the Tuscan. That kind of understanding of the simply of the orders as a means of decoration, not as pasties, that you put on and say, I am classical, but as part of the way in which the building's proportionality is signaled, and which is obscured if it's too richly done, like Versailles. That carries right through to one of my favorite historians, Fisk Kimball, who established the architecture program at UVA, designed the Memorial Gym, and based it on the great rooms of the baths in ancient Rome. You know the Mem Gym at UVA, a wonderful building. And he, it has this kind of facade with the lower parts supported by columns, which are the same height as the columns at the rotunda, the same height as the ones at the rotunda, but in a position that clearly indicates their inferiority. So that the building, that the new gym in 1922, you see, is connected to the ensemble as a whole through the orders as ornament. And, you know, there's lots of other things like that. So yes, they didn't have the skill earlier. Later, when they did, away they went. Now, what do you make of the American Academy as the finishing school, where they're supposed to look at ancient buildings and at Renaissance buildings, as opposed to the rich French buildings that those architects were learning in Paris? I mean, Grand Central Station's a wonderful, wonderful, rich building.
They wanted more sculpture, but they cut it because of the budget.
with the library, yeah. But even when they even when they have a more generous budget, they never reach the level that the Continental buildings do. Do you think so?
Yes, I think you're right. I think once the monarchies and the power of the church waned, no one really reclaimed that level of ornament. But we got pretty close with some of our banks and
Banks.
the custom house. Pastor was custom house in New York. I mean, very rich. The Library of Congress, Capitol.
Well, Library of Congress. If you follow, I mean, Fisk Kimball's book on American architecture, 1928, best book ever written on American architecture. He calls that the wayward wanderings of romantics, and he looks at McKim as the restoration of Jeffersonianism, which I think is what happens. So yeah, I mean, it's good to have a thing like Library of Congress. You think you got a good library over in your museum, Britain? Look at ours, right? Because there's that kind of mimetic rivalry there going on between friendly nations.
Bill, to bring this to close, let's go back to the political ordering. Because you used to teach that the Italian cities, you could see what was higher and lower. And the church would be at the highest level. You'd see the municipal buildings. And you point out Charlottesville, the ordinary buildings of trade, you could see what was higher and lower. Our friend Dan Robinson used to say, the man from Mars would land, he could look at the Parthenon and know it's not a hamburger stand.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, but now the problem is, if you look at this thing, what is higher and lower? It's how do we restore the classical sense at a time when it's the World Trade Center burning up? You have to find the civic building in that way. Well, how do we do that? Because we have this thing in Washington, we have certain restrictions on height, right? To indicate the importance of certain institutions.
Maybe I should just give a pitch for my forthcoming book, in which I discuss this. What we've failed to do, which we used to do, that's why I put the thing at the beginning about banks and courthouses. What we used to do was to ally all the buildings that were built. Well, let me go at it another way. We think of these buildings as examples of what we must build today and what creative architects can build today, right? That's like having at a public meeting devoted to any kind of public issue, someone come in and suddenly start singing a wonderful tenor aria because he can. It's disruptive. It does not contribute to the discourse. Every building is a modification of the existing condition. Every building is a modification of an existing rural landscape or an existing city. And the purpose of that building has to be to make the city more beautiful, as an emblem, as a testimony, as the counterpart to the city's desire to fulfill human nature by the operations of the civic order. In other words, politics is more important than architecture, and buildings always are important for the contribution they make to the city, to the civil order.
This reminds me of a day when Judy and I were with you in Chicago on Astor Street, one of the most beautiful streets in America. And there was this one high-rise that was just disruptive things. I remember you saying, "Don't worry, that'll be down in 40 years." and that's exactly what's taking place. Listen, I can't imagine this talk had been done better. Remind me of there's a time, I just recall a time, I was giving a talk for Bill at UVA for his students. And I called the student over and I said, I think I had to extend that answer I gave you. He said, "What's it all right, Professor? I knew we were going. After all, as Leo Strauss once said." Bill had been teaching Strauss in his courses as the antidote to his stoicism. Bill, thanks so much for that.
Thank you.